This is one of those historic places where, as a writer, I sense the presence of the dead like nowhere else. It's hard to enter La Boisserie Manor House, de Gaulle's family home at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises in eastern France, without feeling that it's still inhabited. His whole personality and character are embodied here, in every piece of furniture, in every trinket, in every painting, and in his library. And in his choice of holding on to the books of his childhood, which strikes a chord with the writer in me. A bit further on, it was at this bridge table where he indulged most evenings in a game of patience. My discipline of idleness, as he put it. It has been left untouched in all its simplicity. He died a few feet away from his desk. Transported by his solitude, it was the only place he could imagine writing. His tall frame hunched over the desk, his fountain pen gliding across the page, cut off from the outside world, his window looking out onto the unspoilt countryside of Champagne. Writers are solitary creatures. This certainly corresponded to Charles de Gaulle's nature. The presence of his friend Winston Churchill comes in the form of a portrait, taking pride of place among the world's greats, but most importantly, his memoirs, always within reach. The simultaneous publication of their memoirs in the late 1940s and early 50s was a global phenomenon. It turned them into writers. Looking back, it seems inconceivable, but Churchill even earned the most prestigious award, the Nobel Prize in Literature. But of the two, was he the worthy laureate? To answer this, you have to look beyond their status as war leaders, their role on the front line, and examine the works themselves. Above all, the answer can be found in the humanity of these soldiers-turned-writers. Their war memoirs must also be viewed through a literary lens, with the benefit of hindsight. 70 years have passed since the books were released, with resounding success at the time. It's no secret that it's always a good idea to dissociate books from their buzz. To understand why their memoirs are still such essential testaments, a trip across the English countryside, so dear to Sir Winston, is called for. The desire of these two authors to instill themselves also as writers in the collective memory means that they must also be judged as such. Let us delve into Churchill's manuscripts, where they are kept away from prying eyes like other incendiary papers in the Churchill Archives Centre at the University of Cambridge. Researchers have much to gain from referring to original documents. Although these are typewritten manuscripts, what is important are the often shaky handwritten notes in the margin, the significance of his corrections, and the nature of his remorse through what he added and removed. As I read his words, I can almost hear him saying them out loud. This is particularly true when he refers to de Gaulle coming to London on June the 17th, 1940. He almost milked it dry.
Dès que l'appareil commence à rouler, de Gaulle sauta dedans et claqua la porte. L'avion prit son envol, tandis que policiers et fonctionnaires français restaient bouche bée. Dans ce petit avion, de Gaulle emportait avec lui l'honneur de la France.
When describing this in his own words, de Gaulle was much blunter and much terser.
Le départ eut lieu sans romantisme et sans difficulté.
A writer's manuscript is not enough to understand them. Their writing style is a reflection of their lifestyle. It's important to explore their home in all its motifs, just like a painter must explore the outdoors. This is Chartwell, Kent, in the southeast of England. When visiting Churchill's home, one gets a different picture of the writer at work. Like de Gaulle, he was also fond of his time in the country, on his estate with his many pets. It's an extremely warm and endearing place for any Anglophile, a backdrop that embodies Churchillism. After all, life is too short to be lived small scale. This extravagance, with its expensive upkeep, was partly funded by some of his friends, a few rich and powerful men from his inner circle. The rest was funded by his earnings from his writing, both journalism and books. It wasn't that writing came easily. Let's just say that he was well organized. His works were inspired by a passion for politics that so few writers share. Proof that being a man of action doesn't stop you from being creative. That may be so, but at what cost?
As an author, I can speak to you about the difficulties and the dangers of writing a book. But I've written a very great many books. I think by the time I was 25 years old, I'd written as many books as Moses. But, writing a book is an adventure. To begin with, it is a toy and an amusement, and then it becomes a mistress, and then it becomes a master, and then it becomes a tyrant, and the last phase is that just as you are about to be reconciled to your servitude, you kill the monster.
He had his very own way of killing that monster. The 6 volumes written about the Second World War between 1948 and 1954 are a good example. Rather than write, he dictated from his bed, a personal space to say the least. He could often be found sitting or lying down with a cigar in one hand and a whiskey in the other, and with papers and documents strewn over the bed covers. There was always a secretary or two with him who felt slightly uncomfortable when he chose to swap his bed in order to dictate from his curious bathtub with the door wide open. Bubbles covered the surface, but it was shocking nonetheless. But he was royally, or perhaps even imperially, unfazed. Churchill called on typists for his writings, but most of all on the syndicate. That was what he called his ghostwriters. Biographers have been able to compile a list of 6. To fully understand his little syndicate, a trip to the basement is called for, where the typewriters face each other. His team provided the foundation, in other words, the literary research, before drawing up a draft. Churchill would rewrite it all, for the writing style was his own. While the Englishman never wrote alone, de Gaulle, the Frenchman, whose portrait adorns the wall of this iconic room, always wrote on his own. It fitted perfectly with his personality. For anyone familiar with the genius loci, it could be said that La Boisserie at Colombey-les-Deux-Églises was made for Charles de Gaulle. It was a manageable size, unpretentious in decoration, and bought for a modest sum in 1934. Above all, it was steeped in a literary past which suited him just fine. It's a little-known detail, but during the 7 years prior to his moving in, a couple of American intellectuals, the Jolasses, were riding the literary and artistic avant-garde wave here, influenced by both German Romanticism and by Surrealism. They lived in Colombey, and at La Boisserie they created a magazine in which they published many texts by Artaud and Michaud, not to mention by the main writer, their pride and joy, James Joyce. The question is, Did Joyce rub off on de Gaulle at all? That is, assuming that two geniuses could coexist in one place. De Gaulle's solitude as a writer is that of an independent man guided by team spirit. In Colombie, he had only a handful of assistants, or rather reviewers, including writer André Malraux. They had the privilege of deciphering his scrawls, a talent possessed by only those used to his writing. The best person to help was his daughter, Elisabeth de Boissieu. She had the task of typewriting texts that were so overwritten that they could have been mistaken for an Alechinsky painting. With this understated and thrifty modus operandi, flanked by such a streamlined team, de Gaulle wrote his war memoirs in solitude. Some friendships are like love affairs. You never forget your first encounter. It rarely goes smoothly. And while their first meeting was no exception to the rule, the second made up for it. They took to each other, although not exactly like fish to water. The Englishman was warm, but the Frenchman came across as a cold fish, maybe even icy.
Monsieur Churchill me reçut à Downing Street. C'était la première fois que je prenais contact avec lui. Il me parut être de plein pied avec la tâche la plus rude, pourvu qu'elle fût aussi grandiose. Par-dessus tout, il était, de par son caractère, fait pour agir, risquer, jouer le rôle, très carrément et sans scrupules.
Je vis le général de Gaulle qui se tenait près de l'entrée, immobile et flegmatique. En le saluant, je lui dis à mi-voix en français « l'homme du destin ». Il resta impassible. Sous son attitude imperturbable, il me parut avoir une surprenante sensibilité à la douleur. C'est une impression que j'ai conservée depuis au contact de cet homme très grand et flegmatique. Voici le connétable de France.
Their writing styles differed, but even beyond this aspect, everything else from their personality, character, lifestyle, and fashion was worlds apart. The Frenchman, on the one hand, would march, a figure reminiscent of a Giacometti sculpture, a towering man who always strode forward, in an officer's uniform that hovered above his chunky boots, a heron. The Englishman, on the other hand, was a portly figure, a quiet man, who strove to live by his two mottos, those of someone sitting in an armchair. He would often say, "Never stand up when you can sit down, and never sit down when you can lie down." The Englishman was deeply emotional, vivacious, and sentimental. He had been a Francophile since the invention of champagne and was proficient in French.
C'est moi, Churchill, qui vous parle. Pendant plus de 30 ans, j'ai marché avec vous et je marche encore avec vous.
He was worshipped by the British, who saw him as their savior. This was undoubtedly his time, and he had to seize it. It was much easier for him to take on the role of national hero, a childhood dream that had followed him right up to his early days in the army. And it was a period that took place in a majestic setting. It was at Blenheim Palace, a regal and imperial world, a huge family castle, that he was born, and where he made himself a promise to live up to his family's legacy. He grew up amongst paintings and tapestries that lined the walls, depicting great battles. He recreated them on the rug with his tin soldiers. This was the theatre of his imagination. It was where he pictured himself as a worthy heir to John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, and a military leader. Growing up surrounded by his ancestors' glorious memories meant that Churchill naturally identified with these legendary figures, to the point of envisaging himself as a future protector of his nation. At de Gaulle's La Boisserie, his library reflects not only the mind and culture, but above all, the soul of this great reader. His childhood heroes were those of the nation and not of his family. For de Gaulle, any writing or any literature should embrace a lexicon and register inspired by the great century, the one that had given France Bossuet and Fénelon, whose books accompanied his adolescence, along with the great authors of the classics, the Romans and the Greeks. He grew up in a family of civil servants and legal experts from Paris, hard-working scholars and legitimist Catholics, who passed down a passion for academia and for serving one's nation. At 15, he already saw himself as General de Gaulle saving France. From then on, it surprised nobody at the Saint-Cyr Military Academy that the only career he had in mind was one in the armed forces. Churchill could not imagine studying anywhere else than at Sandhurst, the British Saint-Cyr. And that is the only thing they truly had in common. Most couples get off to a better start, or at least are more compatible. Churchill, who was 16 years de Gaulle's senior, confided to a friend, "That de Gaulle looks like a female llama surprised while bathing." An imaginative judgment, albeit shallow. De Gaulle wouldn't be outdone. As they left a War Cabinet meeting, he smirked upon seeing the polka dot bow tie come undone on Churchill's plaid shirt and pointed it out by asking, "Are you going to a costume party?" The Prime Minister is said to have quipped back, "Not everybody can dress up as the unknown soldier." It would appear that they both had a sense of humor, but de Gaulle's was so subtle that it is yet to be found. There was no intimacy in his eyes, no pats on the back or familiarity. But none of that mattered, for they agreed on what did. Churchill was Prime Minister and de Gaulle was merely Under-Secretary for War. Yet as soon as he got to London, Churchill treated him as his equal, as the leader of the Free French.
Naufragé de la désolation sur les rivages de l'Angleterre. Qu'aurais-je pu faire sans son concours? Il me le donna tout de suite et mit pour commencer la BBC à ma disposition.
Moi, général de Gaulle, j'entreprends ici, en Angleterre, cette tâche nationale. J'invite tous les militaires français des armées de terre, de mer et de l'air à se réunir à moi.
À mesure que s'envolaient les mots irrévocables, je sentais en moi-même se terminer une vie, celle que j'avais menée dans le cadre d'une France solide et d'une indivisible armée. À 49 ans, j'entrais dans l'aventure, comme un homme que le destin jetait hors de toutes les séries.
Thanks to Churchill, he moved into 4 Carlton Gardens, a prestigious building boasting Doric and Corinthian columns, the Free French Forces headquarters. It's hard to imagine that upon his arrival in summer 1940, he was nothing, a pariah, an outlaw, a treacherous officer with no army or international support. A man alone.
Vive la France, libre, dans l'honneur et dans l'indépendance.
A man alone, a rebel, channeling all his ferocity, rage and anger into defeating Marshal Pétain and the régime of Vichy France.
La vieillesse est un naufrage. Pour que rien ne nous fût épargné, la vieillesse du maréchal Pétain allait s'identifier avec le naufrage de la France.
Two weeks later in London, the Free French Forces were officially created. De Gaulle was joined by a handful of civilians, a few thousand soldiers, hundreds of officers, pilots and sailors. The initiative was mocked in France. It was depicted as being supported by Jewish journalists, aristocrats and fishermen from the Brittany Islands, which isn't entirely untrue either. Yet de Gaulle was convinced that he was the embodiment of France, restoring the French Republic with honor and dignity. It was as if being called de Gaulle had led him to London, even though his English was, let's be honest, his own.
France, at first crushed while acting as a vanguard, will be an essential element in the decisive battles. France, we can, if we will, and better order.
In fact, he became the only Frenchman to be able to proclaim publicly, "I am France," and not be sent to a psychiatric hospital. Churchill found it hard to put up with the unrelenting and unrealistic attitude of a de Gaulle who had been possessed, even haunted all his life by a certain idea of France. At times, his patience wore thin, and he would lose his temper in front of his colleagues. He's a madman.
Nous fîmes néanmoins de notre mieux pour accroître son influence, son autorité et son pouvoir. De son côté, il prenait naturellement fort mal toute relation de notre part avec les gens de Vichy et considérait que nous lui devions une loyauté exclusive. Il jugeait également essentiel à sa position aux yeux du peuple français de conserver une attitude fière et hautaine envers la perfide Albion.
From the Latin perfidia. So perfidious was Albion that de Gaulle had always had, if not a certain loathing, a deep distrust of Britain. This feeling was revived at the beginning of July 1940. The British wanted at all costs to stop the Reich getting its hands on French battle cruisers, stationed at Mers-el-Kébir, an Algerian port. After issuing ultimatums, the Royal Navy sank most of the French squadron.
Les bons navires sont incendiés par les obus britanniques.
De Gaulle was powerless and simply had to endure this annihilation, an act he ended up justifying in his memoirs.
M'adressant aux Français, je leur demande de considérer le fond des choses du seul point de vue qui doit finalement compter, c'est-à-dire du point de vue de la victoire et de la délivrance. Je dis sans embâche qu'il vaut mieux que les navires aient été détruits. Nos deux vieux peuples, nos deux grands peuples demeurent liés l'un à l'autre. Ils succomberont tous les deux ou bien ils gagneront ensemble.
Ce fut une décision odieuse, la plus inhumaine, la plus pénible de toutes celles auxquelles j'ai été associé. C'était une tragédie grecque. Pourtant, jamais aucun acte ne fut plus nécessaire à la survie de l'Angleterre et de tous ceux qui comptaient sur elle.
Almost 1,500 servicemen lost their lives. The patriot de Gaulle, faced with this fait accompli, was shaken to the core, for French blood had been spilled. Not long after, he spared no effort in persuading Churchill to seize the French Navy in Dakar, Senegal. Poor planning resulted in the operation turning into an excruciating fiasco, which both men struggled through together. When he let down his defenses and opened up to his inner circle, General de Gaulle admitted to feeling down. He was demoralized. To put it mildly, he was in the doldrums. For the only time in his life, he was plagued by suicidal thoughts.
Les jours qui suivirent me furent cruels. J'éprouvais les impressions d'un homme dont un séisme secoue brutalement la maison et qui reçoit sur la tête la pluie des tuiles tombant du toit.
Churchill was no stranger to this state of mind. His melancholy, owing to underlying depression, had been under control, yet it reared its head from time to time. He called it my black dog. When it did rear its head, it would hit him like a force of nature, that he kept at bay with alcohol, even more so than usual. But it was no force of nature that hit his people on September the 7th, 1940, but a barrage of fire and steel launched by the Luftwaffe. For 8 months, the Blitz, German for lightning, forced residents into basements, shelters, and the underground, over 50 meters beneath the city. To appreciate the extent of this confinement, a trip to the site of Churchill's underground war rooms is called for. This secret bunker can be found in the heart of the capital. It houses a number of rooms in a maze of corridors preserved in their original state.
Voici le bruit qui fit partie intégrante de la vie de chaque homme, de chaque femme et de chaque enfant d'Angleterre.
Churchill rarely lived here with his wife, his ministers and staff officers. But he sometimes took part in strategic meetings on warfare and battle planning. The large maps of the world adorning the walls of every room, meeting rooms and bedrooms alike, attest to this. It was in this oppressive atmosphere, due to being underground, that Churchill spent some of his time, day and night, thinking in private, sleeping, making decisions, and most importantly, inspiring his people across the airwaves, thanks to the BBC.
We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be.
The way he refers to these events in his memoirs evokes his talent as a journalist. He spent a long time writing in this industry before throwing himself into a literary career.
Les raids de nuit s'accompagnaient d'attaques de jour plus ou moins continuelles, menées par de petites formations ennemies ou même par des appareils isolés. Et souvent, les sirènes retentissaient à de brefs intervalles tout au long des 24 heures d'une journée. Les 7 millions d'habitants de Londres finirent par s'accoutumer à cette étrange existence.
However, despite their importance as British Prime Minister and Free French leader, were they not also part of the same crowd that emerged the following day in the aftermath of the London and Coventry bombings? A crowd that Churchill referred to as ordinary people living through extraordinary times.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
A quintessential Churchillian quote that de Gaulle would later borrow.
Jamais tant d'hommes sur la terre n'ont tant attendu de nous.
I can imagine both Churchill and de Gaulle moved by this photograph hanging on my office wall. It's one of the most iconic images taken during the Blitz. It's Holland House Library, largely destroyed by the Luftwaffe's bombs dropped on the west of the city. The readers are shown choosing books from the damaged shelves, as if nothing had happened. There is something surreal about it, reflecting the madness of the time and the absurdity of such a devastating war. The purpose of libraries is to preserve, protect, and promote books, not to be the macabre spectacle of their destruction. Our two military men always lived through and by books. The manuscripts of de Gaulle's memoirs have naturally been given a home at the National Library in Paris. Consulting them comes with protocol that's in league with the sacred. The original pages can only be opened with a derogation and with the utmost care. To start with, only pencils can be used to take notes. Ink is off limits in case there are any accidents. Here are de Gaulle's writings in his very own hand, messy, broad, and overwritten, with lots of crossings out showing remorse. This reflects his obsession over the choice of words. It meets Oscar Wilde's definition of a writer. Someone who spends all morning putting in a comma, only to spend all afternoon taking it out. It's interesting to compare the state of their manuscripts. Churchill's are typewritten, since he dictated. But from start to finish, so as not to upset anyone and to conform to their wishes, they are full of crossings out, too, with words replaced by others, so as not to offend anyone, especially de Gaulle. Hence the removal of the passages where Churchill describes him, and I quote, a budding Führer. Words crossed out with a blue lead pencil, showing a different kind of picture, something only his inner pastel artist, inspired by every shade of blue, would approve of. Churchill's greatest quality, something that de Gaulle lacked at the time, was that whenever he spoke, he managed to win the public over. Ironically, this was when the true stylist in him came out. His masterpiece, ultimately, was his speeches. Something easier said than done for a man who suffered from a speech impediment.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets. We shall never surrender. Whatever the cost, we shall never surrender.
De Gaulle admitted he envied Churchill's skills as an orator.
Quel que fût son auditoire, qu'il se trouvât devant un micro, à la tribune, à table ou derrière un bureau, le flot original, poétique, émouvant de ses idées, arguments, sentiments, lui procurait un ascendant presque infaillible dans l'ambiance dramatique où haletait le pauvre monde.
This world spiraled when the USA entered the war in December 1941. Despite the admiration shown to Churchill by de Gaulle, their relationship went through another frosty patch with the arrival of a third man, who wedged himself firmly between them. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Churchill was close to him for historical and personal reasons. His mother was American. And he got even closer. It was a twosome that excluded the Frenchman. All that mattered was that Roosevelt was now the leader of the free world.
The President of the United States welcomed the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The gravity of the moment had brought them together.
Roosevelt's visceral dislike of de Gaulle was well known. He saw in him an apprentice dictator. Not only did he despise him, but he also tried to co-opt Churchill, who found himself torn between two allegiances. Roosevelt and Churchill devised a plan to lead an offensive in North Africa, but they didn't want to involve de Gaulle.
Si nous avions mêlé de Gaulle à l'affaire, cela aurait produit le plus fâcheux effet sur les réactions des Français d'Afrique du Nord. Pourtant, il fallait manifestement trouver quelques hautes personnalités françaises, et aux yeux des Britanniques comme des Américains, nul ne semblait plus qualifié que le général Giraud.
Giraud is one Frenchman who refused to bow to the Nazis. Twice he has escaped from German prisons.
Giraud was more cooperative, accommodating, and much warmer than the insufferable de Gaulle. He was the perfect pawn for the Americans, and also a worthy rival to de Gaulle, now sidelined.
Ne brusquez rien, dit M. Churchill. Voyez comment, tour à tour, je plie et me relève. Vous le pouvez, observai-je, parce que vous êtes assis sur un État solide, une nation rassemblée, un empire uni, de grandes armées. Mais moi, où sont mes moyens? Pourtant, j'ai, vous le savez, la charge des intérêts et du destin de la France. C'est trop lourd et je suis trop pauvre pour que je puisse me courber. M. Churchill conclut notre entretien par une démonstration d'amitié et d'émotion. Nous avons encore de rudes obstacles à surmonter, mais un jour, nous serons en France, peut-être l'année prochaine. En tout cas, nous y serons ensemble. Je ne vous lâcherai pas.
Yet Churchill was planning a large-scale operation with the US president. A special transatlantic phone line even enabled the Prime Minister to talk to him at any time. Their General Staff devised Operation Torch in secret, an invasion of North Africa by Allied forces in November 1942. De Gaulle was excluded from all the planning.
J'avais conscience des liens qui nous unissaient à De Gaulle et de la gravité de l'affront que nous allions lui infliger en le tenant délibérément à l'écart de toute participation à l'entreprise. J'avais l'intention de l'informer juste avant que le coup ne fût porté.
Soldiers and sailors, remember, the French are not Nazis or Japs.
The landings on the beaches of Algeria and Morocco gave the Allies a foothold in Africa. It was their first major victory, but without de Gaulle. It was also because Roosevelt had his man and wasn't letting go. It was General Giraud whom he wanted as commander of French forces in North Africa. It was quite clear that de Gaulle's pride had been dealt a heavy blow by his allies.
M. Churchill s'en prit alors à moi sur un ton acerbe et passionné. Il s'écria avec fureur. « Vous dites que vous êtes la France? Vous n'êtes pas la France. Je ne vous reconnais pas comme la France. » Puis, toujours véhément, « La France, où est-elle? »
How could this be perceived as anything else but a humiliation? It was all the more cruel with the Anfa conference being held in January 1943, in front of the world's media.
For 10 epoch-making days, Casablanca became the solar plexus of Anglo-American leadership.
Roosevelt and Churchill were already developing their post-war strategy. In a show of cold fury at his exclusion and that of France, de Gaulle turned up late, making them wait 2 full days.
De Gaulle arriva enfin le 22 janvier et fut conduit à sa villa, qui était voisine de celle de Giraud. Il refusa d'aller rendre visite à ce dernier et il fallut plusieurs heures d'efforts pour le décider à changer d'avis. J'eus un entretien glacial avec de Gaulle et lui fis très clairement comprendre que nous n'hésiterions pas à rompre définitivement avec lui s'il persistait dans son opposition.
Le Premier ministre m'adressa des reproches amers, où je ne pus voir autre chose que l'alibi de l'embarras. Il m'annonça qu'en rentrant à Londres, il m'accuserait publiquement d'avoir empêché l'entente, dresserait contre ma personne l'opinion de son pays et en appellerait à celle de la France. De toute la guerre, ce fut la plus rude de nos rencontres.
De Gaulle eventually decided to sit at the negotiating table to please Churchill, who had firmly insisted. It was a historic moment that was entirely fabricated. He even said to Roosevelt in English, to make it absolutely clear, "I shall do that for you."
That's all right. That's an historic moment. Historic moment. Want to do it again?
Yes, if you please. Most of the men missed it, I believe.
All right. Okay.
Roosevelt insisted on a second take, supposedly for the greater good. De Gaulle, walking out of the frame, was now jointly leading the French forces with General Giraud.
No, I don't think we've been done.
Monsieur Churchill, chaque fois que nous nous heurtions en raison des intérêts dont nous avions respectivement la charge, faisait de notre désaccord comme une affaire personnelle. Il en était blessé et chagriné à proportion de l'amitié qui nous liait l'un à l'autre. Ces dispositions de l'esprit et du sentiment, jointes aux recettes de sa tactique politique, le jetaient dans des crises de colère qui secouaient rudement nos rapports.
The US and the UK wanted nothing less than France under an American protectorate. In de Gaulle's eyes, this was unacceptable, out of the question, and not up for discussion. This explains why de Gaulle was later subject to a third affront. He was excluded from the D-Day planning, the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944.
From General Eisenhower to all soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, good luck.
At 6:30 a.m., the first troops and Allied tanks landed on the beaches of Normandy. At the same time, the man nicknamed the Microphone General was reduced to using the BBC mic, this time to save face and ensure the Free French troops' presence and that of its leader on this historic day.
Après tant de combats, de fureur, de douleur, voici venu le choc décisif. C'est la bataille de France et c'est la bataille de la France.
The circumstances drove him to be more effusive than usual by once again adding a Churchillian touch.
Derrière le nuage si lourd de notre sang et de nos larmes, voici que reparaît le soleil de notre grandeur.
De Gaulle landed in Normandy 6 days after the others. He had but one thing in mind, the liberation of Paris. The Allies saw this as a secondary objective. They even wanted to bypass the capital. But de Gaulle wasn't backing down, and moreover, the liberation had to be carried out by the French, by General Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division to be exact. They had to be first in, and de Gaulle had to be the person to embody this most symbolic liberation in the annals of history. Yet another demand that left his ally Churchill exasperated.
Ce type, de Gaulle est insupportable et c'est lui qui a raison. La France, la seule France, la France libre, c'est lui et nul autre. Et dans l'avenir, ce sera lui, aussi vrai que moi, Churchill, je serai celui de l'Angleterre.
On August the 25th, 1944, General de Gaulle triumphantly entered Paris. Yet, until the day he died, he refused to attend D-Day commemorations.
Je ranime la flamme. Depuis le 14 juin 1940, nul n'avait pu le faire qu'en présence de l'envahisseur. Puis je quitte la voûte et le terre-plein. Les assistants s'écartent. Devant moi, les Champs-Élysées. Ah, c'est la mer. Une foule immense est massée de part et d'autre de la chaussée. Peut-être 2 millions d'âmes. Nous aurons ainsi, tous ensemble, bouleversés, fraternels, sentant la joie, la fierté, l'espérance nationale remonter du fond des abîmes. s'agit aujourd'hui de rendre à lui-même, par le spectacle de sa joie et l'évidence de sa liberté, un peuple qui fut hier écrasé par la défaite et dispersé par la servitude.
Out of all the footage of de Gaulle during the war, this was the first time that he was finally seen smiling. Two months later, he would receive the British Prime Minister, and it was, of course, his friend Churchill once again, with each at the height of their glory.
De Gaulle me reçut à un grand déjeuner au ministère de la Guerre et prononça des paroles extrêmement flatteuses au sujet de mon rôle durant le conflit. Je fus frappé par le respect, voire la crainte, qu'une demi-douzaine de généraux de haut grade témoignaient à de Gaulle, bien qu'il n'eût qu'une étoile sur son uniforme.
The two war leaders are now spending eternity together, just off the Champs-Élysées. The sculptor portrayed them as if they were walking, embodying history but in perpetual motion. After the war, they continued to dominate the political scene. On November the 13th, 1945, de Gaulle was elected president of the provisional government. Churchill, however, was knocked off his pedestal. He was crushed in the elections by a landslide Labour win. Disillusioned, he sought refuge at Chartwell, where he retreated to write his war memoirs. Staying true to his promise of being the historian of an epic, in which he was also the hero, he and his team produced 6 volumes. The first of these was released in 1948. Churchill became a successful author, with high and enduring sales of his work. This is true in both the US and the UK. At Hatchard's bookshop in London, he even has his very own section, specifically for his own works, and also for the numerous books which have been written about him. Meanwhile, General de Gaulle, who had retired from politics and was cast into the wilderness, had just started writing his own war memoirs, cut off from the outside world.
Dans le tumulte des hommes et des événements, la solitude était ma tentation. Maintenant, elle est mon amie. De quel autre se contenter quand on a rencontré l'histoire?
With his Memoirs of Free France, a powerful first-hand account, de Gaulle took off his military writer's hat from the 1930s and put on his historian's one. Writers only appreciate their experiences by writing them down. De Gaulle aimed to create a body of work and set himself apart from Churchill, whom he believed had settled for, and I quote, stringing a lot of things together.
Stockholm, where the Nobel Festival prize-giving was about to be held. 2,000 guests, including the Swedish...
Yet it was Winston Churchill whom the Swedish Academy chose to award in 1953 the Nobel Prize in Literature.
Sir Winston Churchill is unable to be present himself to receive the prize for literature.
The irony is that the laureate couldn't hide his dismay. Churchill didn't even bother turning up and sent his wife to Stockholm in his place.
Dear Churchill, a literary prize is intended to cast luster over the author, but here it is the author who gives luster to the prize.
It's clear that at the time, the award had little to do with literature and much more to do with politics and diplomacy. Sir Winston was expecting the Nobel Peace Prize, which ultimately went to Albert Schweitzer, whom he privately ridiculed. he resigned himself to accepting his own Nobel Prize when he learned that it came with a cheque for £12,000 tax-free. As for de Gaulle, his war memoirs came out a year later. He chose Plon since they were the publishers of the greats, such as Poincaré, Foch, and Churchill. The memoirs made waves in both the political and literary worlds in many countries. Now a laureate of the most prestigious literary award, Churchill was up there with writing royalty, between François Mauriac and Ernest Hemingway, no less. Yet the Swedish Academy is supposed to honor writers, not gifted polymaths and history buffs, assisted by a team of ghostwriters. When you read them with hindsight, Charles de Gaulle is clearly the real writer of the two. A classicist whose mind was governed by flawless French and the written word. Throughout his life, he had a certain idea of France, thanks to literature which had indelibly shaped him. None of that matters, for what remains is the story of a stormy but passionate friendship between two men bound by mutual admiration, two giants whose fates were shaped by the tides of history.
Je savais qu'il n'était pas ami de l'Angleterre, mais j'ai toujours retrouvé en lui l'esprit et les conceptions que le mot France évoquera éternellement tout au long des pages de l'histoire.
Les incidents rudes et pénibles qui se produisirent à maintes reprises entre nous, en raison des frictions de nos deux caractères, ont influé sur mon attitude à l'égard du Premier ministre, mais non point sur mon jugement. Winston Churchill m'apparut d'un bout à l'autre du drame, comme le grand champion d'une grande entreprise et le grand artiste d'une grande histoire.